leaders of the US and Germany have announced they will send tanks to Ukraine. But how much impact can we expect from the new heavy weapons on the battlefield? How might this complicate this conflict? And how likely will the Ukraine crisis end as a frozen conflict? In this dialogue special Ukraine crisis 1 year on, we talk to Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, and Anton Fedyashin, associate professor from the history department of American University. So Peter, you have been in this country for like 25 years,
yes.
And you have seen the development, of course, the problems. Tell us what's your observation, how people are coping with their daily lives in the battle zone, basically.
Well, the past year has in many ways been like the ultimate test of Ukraine as a country, or Ukrainian statehood. For the 30 years of Ukrainian independence, Ukraine has a lot of challenges. It's often been perceived internationally as a country that's struggling, that's had a lot of economic problems, a lot of political problems, a lot of instability, and certainly Russia expected Ukraine to collapse essentially when the war began on February the 24th a year ago. And not only Russia, others also shared that expectation. I think certainly a lot of European countries, a lot of military experts expected Ukraine to fall within a week or so. Mm-hmm. So it was a real test to see what Ukraine was all about, and I think they've passed that test. Militarily, they've done exceptionally well. They've had a lot of successes on the battlefield, and society in general has been a lot stronger than people anticipated. The people have sort of come together. There's been a massive volunteer movement in support of the country, in defense of the country. The institutions have been able to function quite well, although of course the economic damage has been very, very bad from the war. Things like the banking system still works very well, the postal system still works very well, the railways still run. The bombing of the infrastructure has not prevented the energy system from working. So on a lot of different areas, the country has been tested and has basically shown that it's a lot stronger than people thought it would be.
It's significant for the Ukrainians to receive tanks and other like missiles, artillery, from Western countries. Of course, they are arriving. In what sense does that mean there will be like a victory will be ensured with the arrival of tanks from the Germans, from the US, from other countries?
Well, there's no single sort of wonder weapon that's going to win the war. We've seen a progressive, a growth in the amount of weapons that are being provided throughout the war, beginning at the very start of the war and before the war, when the West provided sort of handheld weapons, anti-tank weapons, the sort of things that you would use in a partisan war, which is what people expected at first. And then we had artillery, then they had rocket systems, and now most recently we have the decision to send tanks. So it's clearly moving in a direction of providing Ukraine with more weapons. Ukraine still needs, they still desperately need, they're very much asking for more tanks. The tanks they've been offered is quite a small number, in fact. They want to get longer range missiles, longer range rocket systems. They desperately want to get jet planes, jet fighters. If they get all of these things in the quantities that they want to get, then yes, I think there's a good chance they can secure a military victory. But a lot will depend on the quantities they receive. A lot will depend on the speed with which they receive them, because it's been frustratingly slow from a Ukrainian point of view. We have agreements, for example, on a lot of air defense systems that were confirmed back last year in November, December. They still haven't arrived. Training continues. If we talk about jet fighters, for example, it might take months to train pilots. So Ukrainians are saying now, look, let's start the training now before the political decision to hand them over is made. Otherwise, we won't get them until September, October. It's going to be too late.
So Peter, speak of tanks, and then there's another concern, Ukrainians are firing artillery rounds, like 5,000 a day. Some people say this is the probably amount of orders by a small European countries entire year, in peacetime. So people are concerned there might be a supply issue of the ammunition. How big an issue is that?
Yeah, there is a logistics battle as well as the battle on the battlefield, and certainly there's concerns in Ukraine that Ukraine, because of Russia's airstrike capabilities, it's not realistic for Ukraine to produce the shells, the ammunition it needs here in Ukraine at the moment. So Ukraine is very dependent on the country's partners, the Western, mostly America and European partners. And there's a sense here that there's not yet been a switch to a full wartime footing in these countries. They've not yet made the steps necessary, made the changes necessary to be able to provide the sort of quantities we're talking about. So they're still living on the reserves that had been built up over many years, that are still, they exist still, but they of course are going down. They're depleting quite quickly. So if we don't see a big shift in the approach in terms of new manufacturing capabilities and in new manufacturing operations, it could be an issue within the next few months. There's talk now of joint projects, of Ukraine being involved, of manufacturing being set up in Poland, for example, and America has also stepped up, but it needs to be dramatic. It needs to be, they need to move to a war footing rather than just simply providing Ukraine with what they have at hand or in their warehouses. They need to be looking to manufacture at the kind of rates, the astronomical rates that Ukraine is using ammunition at the moment.
Do you see a sense of urgency, like in European countries or in the US, in terms of making sure there will be enough supply of ammunition to the Ukrainians?
I don't see it yet. I think it's growing. I think it's mounting. But there is a sense that it will come when there's a real absolute desperate urgency. Then they'll suddenly kick in. But then it's going to be. I'm not necessarily saying it's too late, but it will be an issue. It needs to happen soon. We're not seeing that yet, but hopefully behind the scenes it is going on. Every time we have these meetings where Ukraine's partner countries come together. There was recently a meeting in Brussels this last week. That's always something they talk about, and they're very clear to send that message, say we need to move faster. But because these countries are not themselves at war, because they don't have a wartime environment that they're existing in, of course they don't have that sense of urgency perhaps.
You once said, Putin uses NATO expansion as an excuse for his aggressive foreign policy. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think we saw what Russia and what Putin himself really thinks about NATO last summer when Finland announced that it would be joining the alliance. Now, Finland has a border of around 1,300 kilometers with Russia. It's a neighbor. It's very close to St. Petersburg, Russia's second city. So you would anticipate if Russia really saw NATO as a threat, Russia would have complained very loudly, would have protested, would have made various threats as they have typically done with Ukraine, and would have increased their military presence around Finland. In fact, they did the opposite. They said very little. They made no real protest. They said that it was okay, and they actually reduced significantly their military presence around Finland in order to deploy troops to Ukraine. So it was quite clear by the reaction over the Finnish decision that Putin understands very, very well that NATO is not a threat to Russia's security. What NATO is a threat to Russia's foreign policy, because it prevents, by enlarging into regions that were traditionally part of Russia's sphere of influence, or Russia would like to see as part of its sphere of influence, what NATO does in fact is prevent Russia from bullying its neighbours. The Baltic states have been in NATO for 20 years, and they've not made there's never been any suggestion that they could threaten Russia. The idea of NATO actually invading Russia is pretty absurd, and I think that's widely recognised in Russia. But again, it does prevent Russia from using its military in order to intimidate as a foreign policy tool. So Russia certainly doesn't like NATO's expansion, doesn't like NATO's presence close to it, but the idea that it actually poses a security threat to Russia doesn't meet with the reality. And then we also have the factor that Ukraine was never, ever really looking like it could join NATO. There was no hint of it. From 2014, from the seizure of Crimea, Russia's intervention in East Ukraine, Ukraine itself was very vocal saying we need to join NATO, we must join NATO, and NATO's response essentially was, yeah, let's talk about that later, let's just put that off. They didn't make any steps towards bringing Ukraine in closer. They didn't make any policy positions, any noises to suggest Ukraine could join NATO, and it was widely recognised in Ukraine as well as in NATO itself, and one would assume in Russia, that there was no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. So the idea of NATO as the cause of the war is a good way for Russia to move from aggressor to victim, but it is not supported by the reality on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, whether NATO or not, there's a concern. It seems some people have. If Russia was defeated on the battlefield, there's a concern. Several senior officials talked about nuclear war. How big a concern, for the Ukrainians, the possibility of, nuclear warheads being used, or nuclear weapon, maybe smaller, being used on the battlefield?
Well, it can't be discounted, of course. Any suggestion of nuclear weapons is obviously pretty dramatic, and Ukrainians can't dismiss it. However, there is a sense in Ukraine that they cannot allow nuclear blackmail to be successful. Then simply they must surrender, essentially, if that's the case. If they say, well, there's a nuclear threat, therefore we can't fight, so then therefore we cannot defend ourselves, essentially. That's the Ukrainian position, and I think that's shared internationally to a degree. I think there's a recognition that if Putin were to be successful with this saber rattling, this threats of using nuclear weapons, he would do it again, logically, if it works well, if it proves to be an effective way of saying, well, I've got nuclear weapons, so you better not resist. And if that works, then it's going to be used again, and other countries will see it as well. So we could find ourselves in a scenario where nuclear blackmail becomes an acceptable foreign policy tool, and that would have disastrous consequences for the international security, because not only would we see it used by countries that have nuclear weapons, we would see countries without nuclear weapons all of a sudden saying, well, we must get nuclear weapons quickly, otherwise we'll also fall victim to this. So I think it's one of the few issues I think the international community is really consolidated around. It looks at this stage like these nuclear threats are empty, that they're hollow, but of course no one can say that for sure because it's such a serious threat. So I think at this stage the most important thing is for the international community continuing to signal to Russia that it's not acceptable.
No. And you mentioned about probably the impossibility, or at least for the near future, for Ukraine to join NATO. And then people say, many people actually suggest, what about neutrality for Ukraine? Not being part of NATO, not being part of Russia, and then probably that will be acceptable for I don't know, all the parties involved. So hopefully a ceasefire, if not a peace deal, will be achieved, basically a frozen conflict. What about that prospect?
Well, the war's going to be decided on the battlefield. It looks at this stage very clearly. It's not going to be decided at the negotiation table. It's going to be decided in terms of how the military side of things develops. Ukraine was a neutral country for almost 30 years, and it was attacked by Russia. So Ukrainians now see that as not a valid or viable position. If they're neutral, they will essentially be vulnerable to further attack. Ukrainians now believe they must have some form of valid security guarantees, or all we'll really have is a pause. It could be a ceasefire. It could be caused a frozen conflict, but essentially, unless Ukraine has the kind of security guarantees that NATO would bring, or perhaps a direct bilateral agreements with the United States, with the European Union, with Great Britain, Poland, perhaps other European countries, perhaps Turkey, unless they have those sort of guarantees, we're going to have another war in a short period. It will, at best, it would be a pause. If we talk about frozen conflicts, you might perhaps look at the example of Korea and North and South Korea, and the fact that they essentially don't have a peace deal there for 70 odd years, but the two countries have managed to somehow find some sort of a very tense, of course, but balance. But that's largely based on the fact that South Korea has such a strong military cooperation with the United States. So Ukrainians sense they need to have something along those lines. Now, will it be NATO or not? NATO still looks problematic because it's actually a very large organization and it has to have unanimity. All members need to agree. Is that realistic? I don't know. But they need to have something, otherwise the war will just continue in another form, perhaps in the years ahead.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for accepting our interview. Hello, Professor Anton. Well, let's start with some figures. We have U.S. foreign arms sale grew significantly to almost $52 billion US, up more than 49% year on year last year. This is according to data released by the U.S. Department of State. That kind of increase is mostly due to U.S. military support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. What's your take on this sharp increase of the arms sales, what does it reveal about the U.S. role in this Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, the sharp increase is a sign of something that the United States government has never made a secret of, which is that it is the main supplier of weapons to Ukraine. The United States has always been the world's leading arms salesman. Russia is a second. So this war has been a great gift for the military-industrial complex in the United States at a time, by the way, when its profits, of course, began to fall precipitously after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, the problem with all of this is that it has helped the Ukrainians slow down the Russian military advances on their territory, but it's not enough to actually turn things around. So in order to make a difference and to achieve Ukrainian victory, which is increasingly something that even American politicians are throwing into doubt, the United States would have to increase its supplies of military material by a factor of probably 10, if not more.
We see that, of course, the U.S. support is very important, but at the same time, we do see there's let's say, growing doubt, especially among the Republicans. And we know that 2024, there will be a presidential election. If there is a Republican president, do you see there could be a fall of support in terms of weapon sales to Ukraine?
I think there will be a fall of support in weapon sales to Ukraine before the election of 2024, because Ukraine is slowly being displaced from the center of the foreign policy narrative in the United States already. And it actually has less to do with the Republicans and with the slim majority that they actually enjoy in Congress right now than it has to do with historical sort of length of the American public's attention span. We saw a direct manifestation of this in President Biden's State of the Union address just the other day. It was about an hour and 10, 15 minutes long. The overwhelming bulk of this address had to do with domestic policy. And only at the end did President Biden tack on the two overriding foreign policy issues, Russia, with the Ukrainian ambassador there, and then China with the balloon and a whole bunch of other issues. This was most likely a soft launch of President Biden's re-election campaign in 2024. And if that is so, I think that the speech was a clear indication that the focus of that campaign is going to be on domestic issues, not on foreign policy issues. So in that sense, the United States will continue to support Ukraine, but I'm afraid for the Ukrainian sake that the amount of weapons is going to be slowly decreasing.
Slowly decreasing. Let's take a look at the effects probably of those military support from the U.S., from European countries, especially with the tanks, from Germany, from the U.S., U.K., Poland, arriving in Ukraine. What kind of effect, those equipment will play?
So unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the amount and the quality of the tanks that have been pledged, I'm afraid, will not make much of a difference. First of all, the head of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, admitted that last year, Poland supplied 250 tanks to Ukraine. And here we are several months later, and the Ukrainians are again desperately asking for more tanks. This tells us one thing, that the Russians are destroying all of those machines and have destroyed the bulk of Ukrainian tanks since the beginning of the war. I don't see how the supply of 150 or 200 Western tanks is going to make any qualitative difference on the fields. Then there's another issue about the tanks specifically, which is that after all of the publicity around the expected supply of the Challengers, the Abrams, and the Leopard 2s, we are now finding out a week, 2 weeks later about the different timelines for these supplies and the different tanks that are going to be coming in. So the British are ready to leap in with their challengers and to supply the dozen or so that they have pledged. Those will probably get there the fastest. There is a handful of Leopard 2 tanks that the Germans have pledged, and those will probably get there within a couple of months. But then the Ukrainians will have to be trained to use them. But now we're finding out that the Abrams, the 31 tanks that the Americans pledged, are not going to even get to Ukraine until the end of this year or the beginning of 2024. And finally, the Leopard 2 tanks, the most advanced German-built tanks that NATO countries possess, it turns out that the bulk of the European-provided tanks are not going to be Leopard 2s. They're going to be Leopard 1s. These are tanks that were decommissioned in 1985 and had been built back in the 1950s and early 60s. So in terms of the quality and the quantity of the supply, we are now finding out that the Ukrainians are not really going to have the quantity and the supplies in time to make a huge difference, especially with everyone expecting a major Russian advancement.
Do you see the European countries, at least the ruling class, they are determined to carry on the war as long as it takes, probably?
I think that so far the consensus among the political elites in Europe, definitely, and they seem to be making no secret of it, and the same in the United States. NATO, with a handful of allies in the Pacific area, are willing to support Ukraine until a victory. The question is, will there be a clean Ukrainian victory? There are growing doubts about this, but the commitment is there, and everyone seems to be doubling down, both in Moscow and in Brussels and in Washington and in Kiev. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, right now, the pendulum is swinging against their favor in the Donbass along the entire line. Now, the real question is the populations of all of these respective countries. Again, let me go back to what I mentioned before, Joe Biden's State of the Union address. I think the Biden administration has already registered the fact that the American population, by and large, is losing interest in this war and would rather see the billions of dollars invested in the United States. We're seeing the same phenomenon unfolding in Europe, where the populations of Europe are losing interest in this war. And so the question is, when will the political elites of the West sort of register the signals? When will the signals reach a critical mass, and when will that affect policy? I don't see this changing anytime soon, but I imagine that by the summer we may be facing some radical changes in positions over this conflict from all sides.
Mm-hmm. Well, recently, UN Chief Antonio Guterres has warned that further escalation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict could mean the world is heading toward a wider war. Are we seeing that trend? In particular with NATO countries directly or indirectly, mostly, I guess, involved in the war?
The risk of a direct clash is always there. I'm hopeful that that will not happen, but unfortunately, there's not much talk about a diplomatic solution right now. The Ukrainians have made it clear that they expect to reconquer the entire extent of their territory within the 1991 borders, which means reconquering the Crimea. The West seems to be, in terms of narrative, supporting the Ukrainians, although we don't know what's happening behind closed doors. So maybe there are other, more nuanced conversations going on. But again, I think that this spring going into the summer, we may see a change in rhetoric as the war becomes unsustainable, first and foremost, of course, for the Ukrainians.
On the side of Russia, they are under these biting sanctions from the US, from the EU. Of course, its economy suffered. The nation as a whole suffered from that kind of sanctions. But at the same time, we are not seeing Russia basically was put on its knees, as expected by the West, right?
Yes, that's right. So, discussing the sanctions depends on what the goals of the sanctions were. I think that that in itself has evolved over the past months. I think the initial expectation in the EU, in Brussels and in Washington, was that the sanctions would deal this short, sharp blow to the Russian economy, lead to massive instability and the regime change in Moscow. That clearly hasn't happened. Then the hope was that the gradual pain and the threat of greater sanctions would force the Kremlin to change its approach to Ukraine to stop the war. That clearly hasn't worked. Meanwhile, the sanctions have created a massive blowback, first and foremost for the European economies. And now, with the IMF having just published its prediction for this year, we're finding out that despite the crushing sanctions, which certainly have created problems for the Russian economy is slated to grow by 0.3%. Now, this is by no means something to be proud of, but given that Russia's under a cumulative sum of about 12,000 sanctions, it is a miracle that the economy is actually slated to grow this year, and that it shrank much less than the initially expected 20 or 15%. And as a matter of fact, the Russian economy for this year, again, according to the IMF, seems to be expected to perform better than the British and the German economy. So yes, the sanctions have created problems. The Russians will have to deal with them, but they have not yet achieved the stated goals.
What's the solution to this conflict?
Well, I think the solution will start with the lowest hanging fruit, which is the question of Ukrainian neutrality. And it sounds according to what most of the reports have been, that was one of the key issues about which the Ukrainians and the Russians seemed to agree in late March during the Istanbul talks, which the Western powers then rushed to prevent from being signed. That's the easiest part of the solution. The question is, the neutrality status will apply to Ukraine within which borders? Because now that the Russians have officially annexed large parts of Ukrainian territory, it's going to be nearly impossible for the Kremlin to give up that territory in exchange for neutral status and the demilitarization of Ukraine. And at the same time, for any Ukrainian government in Kiev, be it Zelensky or his successors, it will be impossible to give up Ukrainian territory in exchange for any kind of security guarantees from Russia. So I think that after this sharp, violent, tragic part of the conflict is over, we will be looking forward to a very long-term negotiation process with the usual diplomatic give and take and nuances and backroom deals, because this is going to be a very difficult issue to solve. And so the easiest part will be neutrality, and by far the hardest part will be the question of borders.
Well, that's the end of our interview. Thank you, Anton. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.